breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Joe Crowley. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of white-collar crime, so unlikely to be distressing to people. But it's an interesting episode because we have an interview with former Wallaby captain Rocky Elsom. You may remember that we spoke about Rocky's case in episode 50 back in November of last year. And he's coming on the program. There's been some further developments. He's got the documents from the French court where he was convicted in absentia of a number of white-collar crimes. So we'll see what he has to say and where it's going to go from here. All right, well, welcome to the show, Rocky.
Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. So I said to in the intro that we have already done a show on your case, which was episode 50 for those who want to go back and have a listen. And so people might be wondering why it is that we're doing a second show. But it's some new information has come to light because since that last show, you have in fact got the documents, I think, from the court. And so you've got some interesting information which we'll cover. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. Do you think we should just do
a little
recap?
I know you you're always telling me to do an introduction. Okay, I'm going to do a little introduction, Rocky, and then we'll. All right. So, on the 12th of October last year, it came out that you had been convicted in absentia of a series of about, I think, was it 10 white-collar crimes, if I can call them that, dating back to 2015, 2016, when you were the owner and president of the Narbonne Rugby Union Club in France. Does that accurately sum up briefly the position you found yourself in October?
Yeah, close. So the charges, the 10 charges that you're referring to, they're not standalone criminal charges that were upheld. So the conviction was largely because I wasn't there, right? So it's a maximum sentence allowable, far more than what the prosecutor had asked for because I wasn't there. But the actual crime was making payments, which in this case were 293,000 euros, that led to the liquidation of the club 2 years later. And that's a really important point because the payments, as I've given you the court documents, so the payments you see were lawful, they were justified, and they were something that would happen in the regular course of business of a rugby club. So the legal argument is very different to what's being reported, and I know that now, and it has taken a while to get the court documents, but linking 293,000 euros with a liquidation 2 years later is what the case hinges on.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I might go through the timeline in a second. I'm going to not go strictly chronologically, I think, because I wanted to jump in and just talk about some new information which you've got from seeing the court documents. So in October last year, it's announced that you've been convicted in absentia and that there's a French arrest warrant out for you. And at that point, you, I think, are in Ireland subject to arrest by the French authorities. I mean, you didn't know, I'm right to say this, you didn't know anything about the trial, you didn't know anything about the charges when it was announced that there was an arrest warrant for you. Is that the case?
It was almost impossible for me to know.
And
the reason for that is...
Yeah, this is what we've just found out, isn't it? You've got the court documents. What do they say?
Yeah. So, of course, I know that they didn't notify me, and I know that they could have easily. But the reason why, the reason it would be nearly impossible for me to know is because they gained an exemption from notifying me. So the court documents say the public prosecutor is exempt from notifying the defendant of these proceedings. So the international arrest warrant was suppressed, and also the trial. So there's... that's not, it certainly wouldn't happen in Australia, but it's not entirely unheard of, right? But it certainly does make it a lot more difficult for me.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm just having a look at one of the court documents here. It's in French. My French isn't great, but as I understand it, it says, as you said, the public prosecutor is exempt from notifying the defendant of proceedings. That looks like an order of the court in Narbonne. It's got a judicial stamp on it and it's signed, and it's dated on the 27th of March 2024. So that's a long time before the trial even occurred. So the trial doesn't occur until 11 October 24, and you're convicted immediately. And then it's announced in 12 October that there's this arrest warrant.
I was just going to say, you said just before that it's not unheard of for this sort of exemption. Did you find out at all, like, what sort of cases normally are subject to that exemption?
Highly extreme and sensitive cases. So nothing that even relates to this. And so I would be the first one to have it in these circumstances. But not only that, I would be the first one penalized for not showing up when there was no chance of me knowing that it was on. So there are some circumstances when you talk about things, not white collar, you're talking about very serious crimes where secrecy is paramount when they're trying to nab someone. Then if in that case, they can have it without them there, but they're not penalized for not being there. So,
and Rocky, am I right saying the penalty for you not being there was the maximum punishment allowable was given out by the court? Is that the punishment you got for not being there?
Yeah, yep. So it's 293,000 euros worth of payments that they're saying caused the liquidation. The fine was 700,000 euros. They asked for 2 years prison. The judge handed down 5 years prison. So it's an inquisitorial system, which means it's even more important. It's even more important that you're not penalised for not being there if it's been hidden from you, if it is designed to go ahead without you, because an inquisitorial system means that they look at all the evidence and the defendant is not as necessary in that scenario, because it's not a one side going against another. They look at all the documents and they look at all the evidence together. So the fact that I was penalised for that and convicted for that, it does make it a lot harder and a whole lot rarer. So I think a lot of people understand that this is a stitch up, but the scale of the stitch up is not quite obvious to everyone yet. And, that's in part because of the slowness in the release of court documents.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question? Did the court or the judge that handed down those very high penalties, were they informed that the exemption was in place, that you hadn't been informed? Like, were they aware of all of the facts?
Yeah, they were aware of them. Yeah, of course. It's written in the court documents. Like, there's no conjecture. There's no, when I first heard about this, I thought they've sent it to a place that I know I'm not, and somehow got that listed as my address, and that's a substituted service, right? Because I know I haven't been notified, and they've done something shifty like that. Then I get the court documents, and they didn't have to do that at all. They gained an exemption, which means there was no attempt made. And when you get an exemption, that has to be listed on the document. So whoever hears this case knows full well that was what happened.
It sounds a bit like, I don't know if you've read Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial, where Joseph K., the main character, is arrested at the start. He's not told what charges there are, and he spends the rest of the novel trying to work out what he's charged with, and he ends up getting convicted and sentenced to death, and is so confused by the end of the novel, having no understanding of the proceedings or what's gone on, or even having an opportunity to give his case, that he voluntarily goes and submits to the death penalty. It does sound a bit like that to me.
With a different outcome.
I know. Yeah, I know exactly what's going on. So this is different. This is at a larger scale, but this kind of thing has happened many times when I was there. When I was in France, I was held in custody on a charge, complete Mickey Mouse charge, and by a stroke of luck, they had to release me. right? So this is not the first time this has happened. When you see the way it's reported as fraud, embezzlement, personal enrichment, right? But there's nothing like that in the court documents. And I know that they report it that way because, when I was there, I would say something categorically. Take the Qatar Investment Fund for an example. I would say categorically, this is not the Qatar Investment Authority. Just everyone needs to be clear of that. It's not a $500 billion fund that's trying to buy Narbonne, which was an event that happened then. Nobody printed it. It was never printed from me saying that. It was in English papers, but you get this a similar theme throughout the time there. And so when they say, oh, were you blindsided by this? Yeah, of course. I didn't know that there was a trial, but I find it very consistent. And one aspect of it that is a little bit anecdotal, but you go, yeah, this is pretty consistent, is I had numerous pieces of advice saying that I wouldn't be extradited because the conviction was in absentia. And then I spoke to someone who was an expert in it because it was a European arrest warrant. And she said, no, you'll find it very difficult to fight extradition in absentia or not. Right? You'll have to it'll cost money and it'll take time and you'll probably be in custody all that time. And she said, but this is one situation where French bureaucracy will work in your favor because you probably have 6 weeks until the extradition order gets to Ireland. And I was like, you don't know these people like I do. It took 1 day. So there's all these articles in France saying how I disappeared and all the rest. It took them a matter of hours to come to where I worked, to where I lived, and to call me up, the Garda in Ireland, because that's how determined they were to make this stick. So of course, if I am detained, I could be in custody for years. I could I could have everything thrown out, still be in custody for 2 years. So I know what's going on.
I wonder how much you think that there's sort of French pride on the line now. I mean, you're obviously the outsider. You were running one of the historic French rugby clubs. It subsequently was relegated and now doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. Do you think that there's some French pride on the line? Something bad's happened to a French club. You've been fingered as the person responsible for it. Do you think there's a bit of that going on?
You got to separate the French and France from these people. So in this case, there's some motivated individuals who got involved with the club and it went very badly for them. But when you talk about the French people in general, sure, I was an outsider, but they don't care who runs the club. They just want the club to go well. You can get anyone to run it. And so you have to remember when I was the president and when I ran it, so when I say ran it, I had the most control over the organization. They were the most successful they've ever been. We had the lowest budget in the league. We would play teams with the biggest budget in the league. So we have 3.8 million euros. We play a team with 20 million euros and we beat them. The team comes down from the top 14, we beat them by 40. And so you have this environment where it's going very well on the field and financially it's going very well, but politically there begins to be an issue. And the issue is not with French people, right? Because you got to remember this case is being paid for by the French taxpayer. And so French people, they're not in lockstep behind this, right? But there is a group who has the influence that are certainly very motivated. So there's a difference between the two.
Okay, no, good. All right, well, I wonder if we might just quickly do a recap for those who haven't listened to our episode number 50. So just chronologically, you play for the Wallabies, I think you got 75 caps, you're playing in the late noughties, you end up captaining the Wallabies for a couple of years. Then you leave rugby, I think it's fair to say, a little earlier than expected, and I think we're playing for Toulon. How is it you then came to be involved with the Narbonne Rugby Club?
So I was I was playing for the Wallabies in 2011, and the club was in a bad position financially, and they were in last place in the ladder. So if you're in last place, you get relegated, which means you lose a lot of funding. So nobody wanted to touch it. They were just not looking like they were going to make it. So they approached a company that I was a major shareholder in, and said, "Do you think you guys could do something? There's a 1.4 million euro deficit that needs to be fixed up in order to survive administrative relegation, and then you need to fix the team." So as much as that sounds ridiculous, that was something that appealed to me and the other guys and the other Australians involved. So we had a look at it. They were in a 2 million euro hole, so it was much bigger than what they were saying. But there was an allowance from the DNACG, the league regulator, to let the club continue from season to season with a big deficit, which was very it's rare that they would let them do it, but what they're saying is, if you put in this money, we'll give you a couple of years to pay off that. And so that's what happened. So the first 2 years I wasn't involved because I was playing. I wasn't involved a lot because I was playing with the Wallabies and then with the Waratahs and then with Toulon. But when I went to Toulon, I could see that there were some pretty big issues with the club. And despite the fact that you earn a lot more playing rugby, I really felt like if we make these changes, it's going to go really well, financially and sportingly. And so I had said to the guys, we need to do this, which is pretty dramatic, which is basically only sign players that no one else wants and sign them extremely late when no one else is around to compete with us. But if we train them this way, if we do it this way, if we reduce costs this way, I think it's going to go really well. And so that was 2013-14 when I took over. I was still a player, right? So I played for Narbonne as well, but that was when I took over by myself.
Oh, okay. So is at that point because am I right in saying it's set up like a company, and so you're the major shareholder, and that then gives you the right do they call the position the president or something of the club?
So the president was another guy. So he was let's say the chairman of the board, you'd call it here. So he was a guy that had carried on from previous years, but I was the majority shareholder. So I also acted as the general manager and had control over the organisation.
Now, just in terms of oversight, there is also a board, isn't there? And so that you're not sort of a dictator. You don't just do whatever you like. The board does sign off on decisions of the club that are made, particularly financial decisions.
Yeah, so there's the Council de Surveillance, which is a large board that can see everything you're doing. And so there was, I think, 15 guys on that, and there are procedures. And none of those procedures around payments to companies that I'm involved in, or payments to players, or payments to suppliers, none of those are in question. The legality or the transparency of those aren't in question.
Can I just jump on? I just want to understand this idea. You said payments to companies you're involved in. Is that like a shareholder being paid a dividend?
No. So we would. I was the director of performance. So high performance, strength and conditioning, interchangeable terms. And so what I would say is that let's not pay someone a full-time wage. Let's hire the best performance coaches anywhere in the world that can come to us whenever they can. So we had the head of performance of the Golden State Warriors. I won't name the guys to embarrass them, but we had the best. So they couldn't come for very long and they cost a lot, but we had the best. And so that allowed us to reduce our overheads and get a better result. I would take up the slack in the meantime. So let's say they were there for 3 months. I would, take the program for the other 9 months. And that worked a lot better for us. But it also allowed us to, get a much better result out of the players, because high performance is a large part of what you see on the field.
All right. So can I jump to 2015? That was a stellar year for the club, both financially and on the field, wasn't it?
Yeah. So 2014-15, we had a record profit. So we had the lowest budget in the league and we produced a record profit. The performances weren't as good as my first year. So in my first year, 2013-14, we broke every record in the club's history. And I think we had the lowest budget in the league that year as well. And we lost in the semi-final. So we're a game or so away from going to the top 14. And everything looks pretty smooth around then. But at the end of the 2013-14 season, I can give you the newspaper articles if you like. It's going very well. Turned around a huge deficit. Was €2 million. Now we have quite a bit of cash available, cash reserves, and a positive balance sheet. The Council de Surveillance very publicly asked the board to put pressure on me, or ask me, as they put it, to allow them to invest in the club. Right, so they're saying now we would like to take the club back over, and that happens, a month or two after the best season in the history of the club, outside of when they won the premierships.
All right, and that doesn't occur at that point. Am I right in saying that? It's not to 2016, sort of July, isn't it? That you end up selling your shares out or doing a share issue and diluting your shareholding.
In 2014. So after the Surveillance Council asked the mayor, not the board, they asked the mayor to ask, in inverted commas, me to allow them to invest in the club and basically take back over. I say, sure. Now, I didn't particularly want them to, but I went through the process anyway. So I bring the accounts up to date, similar to 2016, and then say, this is the position of the club. How much would you like to pay for your investment in it? And they say nothing. So they don't put an offer forward. They just basically walk away with no explanation. And that's very embarrassing for the mayor's office, because they've orchestrated it, and they basically are saying they've got no intention of paying for it. They just like to take it back over. So 2 years later, in 2016, we have the Qatar Investment Authority situation, which is a bit of a mess, and frayed relationships. And Bob Dwyer, who's on the board, says, I think you got to look at stepping away from the club, allowing them to invest again, and maybe coming back at some point in the future, but at least stepping away for a period. So that's what I did.
And this is in 2016.
The end of 2015.
End of 2015, all right. And I just want to, you talk about the season in terms of 2013-14. I assume that's because it's a winter sport, and obviously Northern Hemisphere winters go over the year. So, and then Bob Dwyer, obviously a legendary Australian rugby union coach, both for the Waratahs and for the Wallabies, winning the 1991 World Cup, I think.
Yeah, so one of the greatest coaches of all time, and would have a case for the greatest Australian coach. So he's involved from the beginning, but he sees what happens with the Qatar Investment Authority. The local people, the mayor, the entire board, the head of Roland Garros, all put enormous amounts of pressure on me to sell to this guy that they say manages $500 billion wealth fund out of Qatar. I say it's not the guy. They keep going for months. Doesn't matter what I say, people don't seem to believe me. And after that, it comes out that he, in fact, is not that guy and is not going to be of any use to the club. The relationship is frayed. And Bob says, I think you should let these guys get involved. And I was like, if I do that, right, they're going to run it into the ground like they did before. And Bob says, there's a guy called Gerard Bertrand, a winemaker who had stayed away from the club. He will be involved, and he is very active in promoting his image, and that's a good thing for a rugby club owner. So you have an enormous amount of money, but you also have a commitment from the mayor to add more money, say double the grant every year if you allow these guys to invest in it. I will still be the single biggest shareholder, but you will have local people, and you won't have all these coup attempts all the time. You'll have a club with an enormous amount of money, and you'll still be the big shareholder. You just won't be able to run it. Right. So I try and find another solution for as long as I can. But at the end of the day, on my terms, I say, if you want to invest in the club, this is what you have to do. And
sorry, can I just jump in? So we're now at the middle of 2016, and so there's another share issue with you say on your terms for people to buy into the club, and that is taken up, and so the club then you then don't become you move out as the major shareholder, then, don't you?
I am the single biggest shareholder still, but I don't have the majority. So instead of having 97% where I make all the decisions, I have 20, and I can make none at that time.
I just want to tease this out because some of the court documents complain that at that point in 2016, the club is in financial difficulty.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems
say that.
Well, it seems strange to me, and I think we talked about this in episode 50, that you would be buying a club that's in financial difficulty, or at least if you are, you're going in with your eyes open. So caveat emptor is the legal phrase. Buyer beware. You look at the books of the club, and you still want to buy it. Matter for you. So that it seems strange that they would buy the club and then complain about decisions you made prior to them buying it, since they would have known about all of those.
Yeah. So buyer beware applies. Right? In France, teams are only bought when they're in financial difficulty. No one has ever been, that I'm aware of, no one has ever been paid personally to sell it as a club like you might in the NFL or the NBA or something like that. So they're always in financial difficulty, and when that happens, except for in this case. And so when they take over the club, it is kind of standard that they bagged the guy before. So they want to make it seem like things are more difficult for them. But in the court documents, there is no reference to, and they certainly didn't include, the financials for 2016, 17, and 17, 18. But they are in the public domain, and you will see that the club has an enormous amount of revenue. So I don't know for sure, but it's close to the highest the club has ever had. So the argument that the court makes is that the club was in financial difficulty, but they didn't use the court documents, and especially they didn't reference, say, the club's bank accounts. So the club has excessive cash reserves, huge amounts of cash reserves for this club, and it also has the investment of the people that are buying in. So in this case, it was 600,000 euros. So they have that 600,000 euros also. And then you have any other list of payments that were a condition of the share issue. So they are loaded with cash, right? And the story that they told was that they weren't loaded with cash, even though their budget is almost double what mine was.
But I mean, what's the league's attitude to clubs being bought and sold? Do they have any input in the conditions in which clubs are bought and sold?
In this case, before the share issue, they gave us a really hard time to make sure that not only were we have a positive balance sheet and cash reserves, but that also everything that we had on our P&L was in the bank, right? So they made sure, they verified the fact that we had, like I said, positive cash reserves and a positive balance sheet. So that's obviously not in the court documents either, but they verified we had an independent audit, and this is all part of being transparent. So as transparent as possible means if there's ever a promise to the club, I pay it, it's in the accounts, then you can decide, you have a month to look at it and decide whether you want to go forward. They looked at it, went forward, then said, this wasn't what we thought.
So when did they say that? That's what I'm interested in. When did they say this isn't what we thought?
Day one. Day one. Like as soon as they took over, they were like, this is, they use this term all the time, is that it was in a catastrophic financial position. And that term is used in the court documents a number of times. And I would say the club's bank accounts, the club's auditor, the club's accountant, the board, myself, an independent audit, all say the opposite. So what do you use as evidence to support that? And there's nothing in the documents that does.
As someone who is not as sports-minded as Joe, perhaps, or some of our listeners, so I guess I would love to have it broken down maybe like, why? Why are they doing this? It seems like they got what they wanted in a profitable club. They got control away from you, like you lost your level of control. So I don't even understand what happened.
So there are many instances where I was right, let's say very right, and they were wrong. And that was almost comical in town. Let's say the Qatar Investment Authority, right? They came out in full support of this guy. I said from the get-go, he's not the guy. Turns out I was right. Right. So there was an element of embarrassment with that. I would say, I know how you want to run the club. I know how you have been running the club. This is how I want to do it. I want this club to be focused on high performance. Everything else comes second. Coaches come second. Administration staff come second. They said, you're crazy. It worked very well, and then they say, well, Rocky is not looking after the best interests of the club because the club would get so much more support from the mayor if he wasn't there. So they attack the club and me constantly, but basically on the grounds that I'm not doing the best thing for the club, despite the statistics that would say opposite, financial and sporting. But the real motivation of it is that in 2018 they had an enormous amount of money and they made a big deal about it being their first season without having the shackles of me on them, as in like the players that I signed and all the rest. And halfway through that season, they sacked the coach that I put in there, Christian Labit. So they weren't doing too bad, right? Not as good for the amount of money they had, but they were doing okay. But they wouldn't have been relegated. They sacked Christian and they put in Justin Harrison. So Justin was a guy that I had previously sacked, worked with him before, but I had previously sacked. They brought him back as a bit of a, like stuff you Rocky type scenario. From there, they lose every match. And that's something that was a particular sore point.
Yeah, so the crucial thing is they get to the end of the season in 2018 and they're last, aren't they? And then they get relegated, and that then has financial consequences for the club.
So that decision is the reason they were relegated, right? So they swapped the coaches when they shouldn't have. Christian goes to the last place team in the league and turns them into the best performing team in the league, overtakes Narbonne, and in a crucial game in the history of the club, Carcassonne, Christian's new team, plays Narbonne to see whether Narbonne gets relegated, right? So Narbonne go to Carcassonne and they get beaten by 50. And so there's months to play in the season, right? But there's nothing Narbonne can do. They've had such a bad run of losses. And so from that point on, right, you get this is Rocky's fault. And so there's one article that comes out once they're assured of relegation. And if you read it, you will say, I didn't realize Rocky had the club relegated, right? Because it's not saying he did this and then it caused the relegation. It says verbatim, Rocky's tenure ended with relegation of the club. And they raise all these things that were later in the court documents, but there's no justification. They would say things like, he didn't even sell it to the Qatar Investment Authority. It's like, yeah, remember, he wasn't the guy you thought he was. Or, that he had all these different problems and, there was, stealing a car and all these types of things. And at the time in Narbonne, people would go, are you kidding? We see what's happening. Like, we're here at the stadium, they're getting beaten every week. It's not Rocky's thing, not Rocky's fault. But 8 years later,
sorry, by 2018 when they're relegated, are you still a 20% shareholder? You're certainly not involved in the management at all.
I'm not involved in the management at all, but they do something shifty where they increase the capital again. So they raise it by 100,000, but then that dilutes my shareholding to something that can't force them to make them sell it to me. And it's a very small share issue, right? So it's designed as that, and it also allows them to get rid of the board that was on when I was there. So there was 2 members of the board that continued on, but through the share issue, it allowed them to be removed permanently, so they couldn't no longer see what they were doing, or if there was a gripe against me, the board could say, this is actually the case, and just send them a letter, and then they couldn't go any further. So they removed them.
This is, to my uneducated in sport mind, this is like the plot of a kid's Disney movie, where there's some evil baddie who's taking over. But this is your real life. Like, this is, it boggles the mind that this is where we're at.
So a good indication of what it's like is when you go to an Australian lawyer, it's a barrister or something, to have a look at the case. He says, you read a few lines, he says, no, this is over. You can't do that. You'll have it dismissed. Even in France, that's indefensible. And then I say something like, oh, let me just keep reading in case there's something else. Something else comes up, he says, I'll stop you there. Let's not waste any time on this. Don't worry about the detail of the charges. Those two mean this can't be done. You can't say something is unjustified when you know that not to be true. You can have that case dismissed. And then you go through it, and then, like, let's say an Australian point of view would be, are they really calling this forgery? The fact that a contract was signed 2 weeks after it was dated, even though the employment was continuous. And even though there's no clear indication that I'm involved in that other than signing it at some point. Yeah. And then when you look at the legal argument saying the 293,000 euros led to the liquidation 2 years later, even though during that time they spent 12 million euros, let's say, between 12 and 15 million euros, they go, this is bizarre, right? But if you take it to a French lawyer, and obviously I get multiple French opinions, they say, ooh, this is going to be hard. And I'm like, yeah, but now I know they gained an exemption. And they say, but you've been convicted. And I'm like, well, I've been convicted in absentia. Surely I can launch an opposition in absentia. And they're like, maybe, but. And I said, all these charges are without merit. And they go, yeah, well, be that as it may, you've got an uphill battle here.
It's interesting. We finished the last time we talked about this in episode 50, and we were having a joke and saying, he was convicted in absentia. I wonder if they'll say that he can't appeal in absentia, so he has to turn up. And I was literally joking, but that is actually the case. There is a hearing coming up, isn't there? And you are required to be there. Otherwise, they're just going to reconvict you.
The reason why the reaction from the French is so much different is because they recognise that the fix is in, and that becomes the focus. How do you get around that now that the conviction has already been handed down and that was the intention? So for a number of reasons, that becomes more difficult.
So do you have to go there for the next stage of the hearing?
There's an avenue for me to not do it. So the law allows for you to have an opposition in absentia, but it's just very easy for a judge to say, great, we'll take that on board next time we see when Rocky comes here. If he doesn't come here, we're not able to. So inquisitorial system, they would say we're not able to get this information, in the proper process. So the conviction is may stand.
Can you not appear remotely, like so that you're present but not in person? No. And
you can, right? You definitely can. There is the avenue for that, but the chances of them allowing that are pretty slim.
So I meant to ask this actually early on because I was looking at that court document earlier and I noticed the stamp on it. And so is this going through the courts that are actually in Narbonne? So it's not going through Paris or anything. It's in Narbonne. And are the judges there elected?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, okay. And how big's Narbonne as a town?
50,000 people.
Yeah, okay.
So if you turn up in person, will you be arrested?
The chances of me being put in custody, so if I turn up for the opposition, then, there's an international arrest warrant. So yeah, of course I would be. But let's say I go to the opposition and I'm successful, right, and they order a retrial. I'll likely be in custody until the retrial. That could be years. It could be 6 months, but it could also be 3 years.
Yeah. I loved a book that came out in the early 2000s called Almost French. I don't know if you read it. by an Australian journalist who went to live in France. And the book is just this series of, the bureaucratic nightmares that she goes through and doing really simple things like renovating her apartment in Paris. And so when I sort of heard your story, I thought you don't want to get caught up in that French legal system if it's that bureaucratic, because she was waiting 6 months for some very basic stuff to occur, in her apartment. I thought, jeepers, you don't want to be. You could sit in jail here for 6 months, waiting on an appeal. So yeah. So can you tell us how you're going to try and get around all that?
Well, you got to remember too, there are a number of players in Narbonne that played for Narbonne that were sacked without any real cause, right? So it's public what they said they did, with things that are very minor and wouldn't stand up in court. They haven't had the unfair dismissal cases heard for 9 years. It's coming up to 9 years. So they should be heard within 6 months. That's the law. Very strong labour laws in France. But for whatever reason, these players who, some of the club's best players, are being blocked from having their unfair dismissal cases heard. And 9 years is a long time. Even for France, that's a long time.
Do you think it's because what comes out in those unfair dismissal cases will have a positive impact on your position? Could.
So if they say that that's unfair, right? Particularly, there's no event, right? So there's no incident that caused it, and it's very hard to sack people in France. So if it comes out that these players, some I know well, some I don't know particularly well, but if it comes out that they were unfairly treated, then it's the opposite of the story that's being repeated, continually, which is basically that Rocky was the cause of all the problems in Narbonne.
Wow.
All right, Rocky. Well, best of luck. It's February, isn't it? Late Feb. You've got another hearing.
If it goes ahead on that date, yeah.
All right. Well, best of luck for that. We might give our listeners a follow up. I think it's the first time we've done 2 episodes on exactly the same topic.
Well, except of the developments, and as not as a lawyer, but just as someone who wants to give you advice, I would say do not go back to France.
Yeah, it's probably sensible.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, not planning on it. So
that is horrific.
Yeah, fantastic. All right.
So
Rocky. Far away. What do you want to?
If I can just say one.
Yeah, of course.
Just say one thing. This is 90% PR, right? This case is 90% PR. The legal case is so weak. The irregularities in the process are so glaring that this is PR. So if you hear the case, if you hear the details of the case, then it gets weaker. So as much as you think legal cases are on heard on legalities, this is PR.
Well, let's hope.
Thank you for having me on.
No, we're very happy to have you on. Let's hope you can get into court and cut through all that PR and get to the truth of it all.
And give us the update in person maybe next time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Lovely. All right. Thanks, Rocky. Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.